Please welcome to the stage, Dean Karen Yarhi-Milo.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to be with you. Thank you all for being here. I'm Karen Yarhi-Milo. I'm the Dean of SIPA, the Adlai E. Stevenson Professor of International Relations. First, I want to extend my gratitude to the students of SIPA's MPA program in Economic Policy Management. Who's here from this program? Yay. Thank you so much. Your curiosity and initiative sparked the idea for today's event. I also want to thank Trish, our own Trish Moser, for her leadership in organizing this discussion, and the Institute of Global Politics for hosting us. I also want to extend a warm, big gratitude to the event team at SIPA under the leadership of Susan Lee. Susan, where are you? Here you go. For really doing superb work. Earlier this week, 2 days ago, we had a major, fantastic event in Washington, D.C., and the team is working extremely hard, and I just want to thank them for all the incredible and hard work. And Christina Shelby and Lauren Hoffman for all that they do at IGP. So today's event is important. Protectionism is back in Washington, and since last month's inauguration, we've seen a flurry of executive orders, economic shifts, and major policy announcements, many of which will reshape foreign aid, federal agencies, and global trade relationships. Proposed tariffs on Mexico, Canada could disrupt decades of cross-border commerce, while new trade barriers on China, one of our largest trading partners, have profound implications for industries like semiconductors, pharmaceutical, steel, energy. And together, these three countries account for nearly 1.3 trillions in imports, almost half of all goods entering the United States. Now, these policy shifts are fueling a vigorous debate. What will tariffs mean for American manufacturing jobs, inflation, and capital markets? How might they impact sanctions, global supply chains, and economic alliances? What do these changes signal about America's global leadership and the role of the US dollar in the world's reserve currency? And are we really entering a new era of economic fragmentation? See, these are exactly the kinds of complex questions SIPA was built to address. Our role is to train future leaders to navigate uncertainty, to anticipate geopolitical consequences, and shape policy responses that rise to the moment. That's why we convene discussions like today's event at SIPA and in IGP. And I cannot think of a better person to help us unpack these issues than my good friend, colleague, co-teachers, and soon-to-be co-author, Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton, and the panel of distinguished fellows and faculty who are with us today. Secretary Clinton needs really no introduction, but I'll offer one anyway, from serving as First Lady, to representing New York in the US Senate, to leading US diplomacy as our 67th Secretary of State. She's really been at the center of America's most pressing economic and foreign policy decisions. In her class that we teach together, I see many faces of our former students. And today she brings that experience to SIPA as a professor and a chair of IGP's Faculty Advisory Board. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton to the stage.
Thank you very much, Karen, and welcome to all of you. And this truly is a student motivated event. I know that, as Karen said, it was initially proposed by students in the master's program for economic policy management here at SIPA, and I'm particularly thankful for their ideas, their leadership, and encouraging this important conversation. So we're meeting at a moment that feels something like the pause before a giant roller coaster drops, because the Trump administration's policies are about to shake up not just the global economy, but the geopolitical world order that we have operated within for decades. And our panelists today could not be better prepared to talk about what that means for Americans at home, as well as our positioning in the world, our national security. And I want to just take a few minutes to talk briefly about some of the considerations that I think should be taken into account when it comes to protecting American interests abroad. You know, it's one thing to talk about America's interests as some kind of isolated question. But in our interconnected world, the fate of economies and societies around the world bear heavily on our own security and prosperity. We know from history what happens when America takes an isolationist approach. When we believe that strong defenses are enough to keep us safe, but we also know the consequences of that kind of approach to geopolitical conditions. Our foreign policy, since at least 1960, and even before with the Marshall Plan, represented a realistic assessment about how our security was impacted from the lack of economic opportunity elsewhere, the denial of human rights, and now, of course, a changing climate and strains on water, food, and energy. I have seen firsthand how multilateral and bilateral relationships impact us. I think our partnerships and our alliances are among our strongest assets. And economic cooperation has helped to advance our interests as well as our people's economic prosperity over a very long period of time. So we have to look at these economic questions that the panel is about to address in the much larger context. And I hope that this will be a provocative conversation, because our panelists are experienced, they're experienced practitioners, they're experienced academics, teachers, and people who are involved on the front lines of both analyzing and making policy. So now I'm going to turn it over to the director of the Economic Policy Management Program and a senior research scholar at SIPA, Patricia Mosser.
Please welcome to the stage Patricia Mosser, Richard Clarida, Wally Adeyemo, Merritt Jano, and Mauricio Cardenas.
So, afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Secretary Clinton. Thank you, PEPM students for proposing this in the first place. We should really get right to this, because there's so much to talk about. It's a little terrifying how much there is to talk about. But we're interested in the economic and financial impacts, as well as perhaps the international reactions and countermeasures. And all of the panelists in different spheres are going to talk about those things. Let me briefly introduce them. Starting us off is going to be Merritt Jano, SIPA's Dean Emerita, Professor of Practice in Law and International Affairs, and former WTO appellate judge. Next will be the latest addition to SIPA, Wally Adeyemo, IGP Distinguished Fellow, this may be his first day, I'm not sure, second day perhaps. But until 2.5 weeks ago, he was the Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Treasury and held numerous senior positions in both the Obama and the Biden administration. Next is Mauricio Cardenas, SIPA Professor of Practice, the head of the Global Leadership Program, and also importantly, the former Finance Minister and the former Energy Minister of Colombia. And last and absolutely not least is Richard Clarida, the Lowell C. Harris Professor of Economics and Professor of International Affairs. He is the former Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve and former Assistant Treasury Secretary. Everything else you should just Google. So, since trade, for better or for worse, is absolutely top of mind with the Trump second administration, I'm going to ask Merritt if she'd be willing to start. Everybody's going to make a few opening comments on the particular areas that they think are important to emphasize. I'll ask a question or two, then we're going to open it up to everybody else. Okay? So, please, Merritt.
Do you have a question for me, or should I just start?
Just go.
Okay.
Well, a comparison of first administration, second administration.
Okay.
A little bit about reactions.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, it's a privilege to be here with this distinguished group of real experts and all of you. So, Patricia Moser asked me before we came in today, what's the difference between the first Trump and the second Trump administration on tariffs? And I guess I would say to you that we saw in the first Trump administration, a real tariff policy directed at China and a trade war with China. And we saw a renegotiation of NAFTA, now called USMCA. But I think there's been a broader conception of the use of tariffs in this administration that is being rolled out. And we don't yet have the full picture. But I would say, first of all, for the students in the room, tariffs have a long history in the United States. Tariffs have always been an instrument of U.S. policy. It was used since the founding of the Republic as a way of restricting imports to help domestic industries. It was a use to generate revenue when we didn't have a general system of taxation, and it was used as an instrument of reciprocity to gain access to markets to deal with unfair trading practices. So those uses of tariffs have long been with us, and I think we're seeing them all being used right now and combined in both traditional and very unusual, novel ways. And so I think one of the things we're seeing is tariffs as leverage. And tariffs as leverage, to deal with perceived unfairness, but also tariffs as leverage to deal with bilateral trade deficits, which are being linked in current policy to unfairness. And, I think that's something that our economists here, should comment on, because I think that's a very non-traditional use of tariffs. If you see bilateral deficits as inherently an instrument of unfairness. And it's also not just trade for trade, which I think is a traditional approach, but trade for non-trade objectives. And so, as you've seen, we just recently saw the invocation of national emergency powers of the president being utilized through the application of tariffs vis-a-vis Mexico and Canada and China. In the case of Mexico and Canada, paused, but a proposed 25% tariff for fentanyl, transshipments, and around immigration concerns. And we've seen the application of tariffs under both that authority and I think under more traditional 301 authority as well, vis-a-vis China. So trade, tariffs as leverage, and then leverage for what is one of the questions I think we have to be asking ourselves, both for economic objectives and also for non-economic objectives under both traditional authority and I think novel use of legal authority. We're also seeing the use of tariffs as revenue, and that, again, has been used in our history as a nation. But what we have heard is that this revenue is going to, in effect, fill the gap between making the tax cuts permanent and the gap that will follow from that, which I have just not seen an estimate that says that's actually doable. I've seen a multitude of studies now coming out that are showing between $1 and $1.5 trillion gap. Others here may have different views on that. So as a practical measure, tariffs as revenue can take us some ways, but I think that argument is something we should look hard at. So I think we could talk a lot about what is this going to do to the system and what will it achieve. We just don't know the full profile. We know it's injecting a lot of uncertainty. We know that tariffs actually impose costs of various types, and there are both intended and unintended consequences that follow from those. I think the costs will be to the American consumer, maybe not huge, maybe significant, depends on what level. Will have producer impacts, and it could cost, not all manufacturers can absorb those costs. There could be job losses in the United States. Other countries will doubtless retaliate. China already is. And I think there's a question of what it does to the safety and the security and the predictability of the international trading system. I think there are bigger concepts that are going to be rolled out. We're beginning to see hints of those, of designing a new international trading system. We could talk about that if you want to. I think those are very consequential. And I should note that some countries are already indicating they're going to try to address the concerns that the US has raised. Mexico and Canada are really trying to respond on fentanyl and immigration. But I think there are both short-term gains and longer-term consequences. We could talk about both. Let me stop there.
Okay. Thank you. So you gave a great segue, because I was going to ask Wally to go next, because the tie between tariffs and taxes and tariffs and fiscal. But I'd also be very curious in his views about, I'll call it international economic diplomacy, if you like, because in his previous seat he had a lot of experience in that. So please, Wally.
Well, thank you, and it's wonderful to be here on my first day on campus to get to do an event like this. And I'll just say a word to all of you, the students. The reason I'm here is because of you. Ultimately, at this point in life, one of the most important things for me is thinking about who are going to be the next set of leaders, not only in our country, but around the world, because leadership matters. The only way things get done is when you have good leaders who think creatively about the future and are willing to make hard decisions, because governing is extremely hard. It's not easy work. But in talking to the dean and talking to Secretary Clinton and talking to many of you, I was convinced that coming here to IGP, but also to SIPA more broadly, was an opportunity to both work with you, to talk to you, to think with you about what the future looks like and how the future can be better than the past. That's ultimately what people who are interested in going to a place like SIPA want to do, and I look forward to seeing you more personally in office hours, so please do stop by while I'm on campus. But I think that usually in the United States, when we face moments of uncertainty from an economic perspective, like the one we're in right now, it's because of an external shock. And the reality is that when you look at where the US economy is, it's the envy of the world. We have above trend growth, we have historically low unemployment. Despite the data reading today on CPI, we have inflation that's returning to 2% over time. And the challenge that we face in this country is less the macro, and it's more when you look at the disaggregated data and you look at the people who make under $100,000 in this country, who don't own assets, they have felt as if, rightfully, the economy has not worked well for them. And what you've seen in response to that is a sense that institutions need to change, be it the global trading system or be it domestic institutions. And the debate that we're having in this country, the most important debate, is what do we do and how do we do that? And today, there is uncertainty about how tariffs will be run and how they'll be used. But there's also debate about whether your payments will come to you if you're a Social Security recipient or if you're a grantee. And I think that fundamentally, as you think about this, what that leaves both international actors but domestic actors with is a great deal of uncertainty about where the economy is going. And slowly that will play out, but I think one of the things that I wanted to speak to was this idea of using tariffs and using tools like sanctions going forward. One of the things I did in the Biden administration was spend a great deal of time helping to not only build an international coalition to use sanctions against Russia, but to think about how we did it in a way that was collaborative with those countries who had different incentives than we did. And I think that while tariffs is a different type of tool, ultimately the reality here is that the main difference is the unilateral nature of America's approach. And what that means is that for countries that are traditionally our allies and partners, they now need to think differently about their relationship towards this country and how we will act and how they will act going forward. I think that's going to require that is already creating fundamental rethinks, not just for the countries like Colombia, Mexico, and Canada that have already been subject to threats of tariffs, but for a number of other countries, be they our traditional allies like Japan, the EU, and ultimately they're going to make decisions about what they think they should do in response, not just unilaterally, but also as groupings as well. And it's something that we're going to have to watch here in the United States. And while we're focused in the immediate moment on how these tools are being used, a conversation in Washington that's happening today is about how do we think about our approach to domestic taxation. And while tariffs is going to play a role there, and it appears to be a very domestically oriented issue, what we do in terms of our tax cuts this year and how we think about fiscal policy is going to matter a great deal to the world. If the United States debt continues to grow and the cost of borrowing in the United States increases, it'll have an impact on the rest of the global economy. So while some of these issues appear to be domestic in nature and others tend to be international, I think one of the things the president has done is that he has taken what often used to be a separation between foreign policy and economic policy, and in lots of ways melded them to say that the chief interest for him is really around what can we do to further America's economic interest in the world. And that is the primary purpose that he is using all his tools, from what would traditionally be considered national security tools like sanctions to traditional economic tools like taxation. And it's something we're going to have to watch as we go forward.
Thank you. And since you brought up the global economy, I'm going to turn to Maurizio next, if I may.
Sure.
And ask him to make a few points. Trade, where to start? Trade, international relations, international financial flows?
Well, thank you. I'm also delighted to be here. Welcome to SIPA, Wally. Look forward to interacting with you. It's a great place to be, especially because of the students. I was asked about the consequences of Trump 2.0 abroad, international effects of this. So the first question I asked myself was, what's Trump 2.0? Well, how do you define that? And I'd say it's built around three premises. Premise number one, you can use tariffs for national security purposes. Premise number two, you should use tariffs to reduce the trade deficit. And premise number three, you use control on illegal immigration to protect American jobs and provide safety. Those are the three premises. Are they going to succeed? We don't know. I mean, for now, what we have seen, I think, is mostly uncertainty. If you measure policy uncertainty, say the average, the baseline is 100, that's kind of like the standard. Today, we are at 300. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And uncertainty, we know, generates an attitude towards essentially reducing aggregate demand. you reduce investment. That's kind of like one of the consequences of uncertainty. So if anything, so far, this could have negative effects on growth. Now, do students that take the macro classes know that trade deficits really have not so much to do with tariffs, but with excess expenditure. When you spend too much, you have a trade deficit or a current account deficit. So should we expect an increase in tariffs to really get rid of the trade deficit in the United States? I think the answer is that it's not sure that that's going to happen. What are the average tariffs here in the United States now? It's about 3%. The effective average tariff is about 3%. What is the intent? If you take the president's argument to the extreme, the concept of reciprocal tariffs, which is I'll put you a tariff which is the same one you have for me. Reciprocal tariffs can take the average tariff in the US to 10%. So let's take that case. We go from 3% today to 10%. What is the consequence of that on the global economy? Well, certainly we're going to reduce trade globally. And with lower trade, the global economy is going to suffer. Some countries could say, oh, this is against Canada or Mexico, so if I'm Brazil, I can actually gain, because I'm not going to be impacted by those additional tariffs. But that's short term, because investors in Brazil know that in the future, the tariffs with Brazil, if Brazil succeeds and sells more in the United States, then tariffs to Brazil could go up. So what about the trade deficit in the United States? I think the trade deficit, and Wally kind of like alluded to this, the trade deficit in the United States has a lot to do with fiscal policy. The US has a large, very large fiscal deficit. And the projections are that the fiscal deficit is going to remain very high for the next 10 years, about 6% of GDP. That's a huge fiscal deficit. So the answer, the standard answer in this current environment is that, tariffs are going to generate revenues, and with those revenues, we're going to close the fiscal deficit. That's wrong. That's not going to happen. Why? Because at the same time, the fiscal policies that have been announced, that were mentioned in the campaign by President Trump, all point in the direction of an increase in the fiscal deficit, extending the tax cuts, generating other tax incentives. All of those things really will push the fiscal deficit in the wrong way. They'll generate more of a deficit. So you don't see that with tariffs, you're going to solve that problem. Tariffs, at the extreme case of a 10% average tariff, they're going to generate only 1% of GDP. So it's a huge problem. Then comes Dutch. So you say, okay, but government expenditures are going to be cut in a way that they'll take care of the fiscal deficit problem. Well, the fiscal deficit problem of the United States, it's measured in trillions. Dutch at best, I mean, if you shut down entire agencies like the USAID, you save a few billion. So the issue here is trillions. So Dutch is not going to fix the fiscal problems of the United States. So my take is the trade deficit in the United States is going to remain despite the fact that you have a 10% tariff. And if you have a 10% tariff, you're going to have more inflation in the United States. It's going to be harder for the Federal Reserve to cut rates. And therefore, this is going to have a negative effect on the entire global economy. And let me say just one word about the controls on illegal immigration. So the idea is to protect American jobs. Well, if you compare the total employment today in the United States relative to 2019, 100%, not 80% or 70%, 100% of the new jobs in the United States have been filled by foreign-born workers. And the unemployment rate is 4%. So if you restrict immigration into the United States, the only thing you're going to put more pressure on the labor market. So salaries are going to go up, prices are going to go up. So the net effect of that is not going to be more economic growth. It's going to be more inflation. Therefore, I think that we still have to see how the whole program unfolds. But unless there is action on the fiscal front, I think the US trade deficit is going to remain high, and contrary to what is expected and what is being kind of like higher tariffs in the United States are going to result in lower economic growth and much greater inflationary pressures. That's my take.
Okay. Thank you, Maurizio. And on that very cheerful note, Rich, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, batting cleanup here. Agree with everything that was said. Maybe in the interest of comparative advantage, I'll talk a little bit about the very good set of initial conditions in the economy that Wally mentioned, and then talk about the outlook for this year, in particular how it feeds into the Fed's thinking about the outlook. And so in particular, the Fed has a mandate from Congress. It's very specific in statute that the Fed's job is U.S. employment and price stability. So whatever motivates a Fed decision to cut rates or stay on hold or hike rates is solely motivated by the outlook for U.S. inflation and employment. So a question I often get, both as a professor and as a Fed vice chair, was to what extent do global considerations factor into Fed thinking? And I gave a couple speeches on that, but the quick version of it is it's quite relevant for several reasons, because the global outlook is very important to the U.S. outlook. Booming global economy helps U.S. exports. A depressed global economy it hurts the U.S. economy. Global developments are relevant for inflation, a big move in the dollar for whatever reason. A tariff is in that category, obviously, and I'll get to tariffs in a moment. And in particular, in a recent piece that I published in the FT, I made the point that in 2019, the interesting thing about that episode is that inflation had been quite low, and even though there were concerns that tariffs would be inflationary, they were not that broadly applied outside of China. And if anything, in the U.S., inflation actually began to fall below the Fed's 2% target. And we believed at the time, and now the staff briefings that the Fed was receiving are now in the public domain. And indeed, the emphasis then was trade policy uncertainty until it's resolved in and of itself is a headwind to growth. People delay investment decisions, they delay hiring decisions if they have international exposure. And I think that will continue to be relevant in this cycle. Also, there's a lot of uncertainty about immigration policy, about fiscal policy. And so I could very easily see a scenario where 2025 is about the uncertainty about what policy actually looks like in 2026. And I think that will be relevant. But a big difference between the current episode and 2018, 2019, of course, is that inflation's not been too low, it's been too high. Inflation's been above the Fed's target now going on the fourth year. And the reason why that's relevant is that the sort of standard central banker textbook answer to the question, how should you respond to tariffs, would typically be, you don't view it really as inflationary, it's a one-time increase in the price of imports, such as a value-added tax might be an increase in the price level. But the footnote to that chapter in the textbook also says, that's only true if inflation expectations remain well anchored, and back in 2019 they were. A potential challenge for the Fed right now is, given the last 3 years, inflation expectations, although they appeared, and I think continue to be well anchored, are sensitive to data. We saw evidence just last week. The University of Michigan survey of one-year inflation expectations popped up to the highest reading in like 20 years. We got some disappointing inflation numbers today. So my takeaway from this is that the Powell Fed is going to be very attuned and attentive to looking at high-frequency measures of public expectations and business expectations of inflation. I know the chair was just on Capitol Hill this week for his testimony and reinforced what he said in his press conference recently, which is that they're in no hurry to cut rates. I think they've bought time, they've bought the optionality for most, if not the rest of this year, to see how the data flow does come in. So maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. So thank all three of you, or four of you, excuse me. Thank you. I'm going to pick up on a couple of things that Rich and Maurizio talked about and make first a statement and then a question. In any other country in the world, probably, the kind of upheaval and uncertainty, all four of you talked very distinctly about uncertainty, that we have seen in the last few weeks would probably increase fiscal financial costs. There'd be a pullback in capital flows. There would be, as both Maurizio and Rich said, expected declines in output and investment. I was actually at an event last evening with the CEO of a major private equity company and said there's no big M&A going to happen. The administration may want it, but it's not going to happen because the uncertainty is too high. And I took that as an interesting comment. Anyway, but all of this leads me to believe that if these things don't happen and the economy slows, and given the administration's other fiscal plans, this is kind of a prescription for a fiscal crisis. So, at least you would think that in any other country that wasn't the world's reserve currency. So I think my question is, how concerned are the four of you about this and the sort of impact it's going to have on not just the United States, but if you have a fiscal crisis in your reserve currency, it's almost automatically has big international impacts. So who'd like to go first?
I'll volunteer the until recently Deputy Treasury Secretary.
What great colleague
I was hoping you'd say that.
Let me go first. And I think my view is that the advantage we have in the United States is that we're coming at this from a position of strength. If you think about the rest of the world right now and where the global economy is, you wouldn't want to switch places with anyone else, given how strong the U.S. economy is. And I think you're right, Trish, that ultimately choices matter, and the choices we make are going to matter in terms of the fiscal trajectory for the United States. But my view is that if we did nothing, the United States would have a very good 2025. Now, the uncertainty that's been introduced, I think, is a clear headwind, but the biggest issue that will determine the way the world thinks about the United States from a fiscal standpoint is what happens with regard to reconciliation. And the decisions on whether we pay for for the tax cuts that will be a part of this, or whether we find a way to say that we're not going to pay for them because tariffs will, or we're going to re-baseline. I think that will have an impact on, will have a big impact on rates at the very least, but will also have an impact on the way the world views us. Ultimately, the hope has to be that some of the uncertainty is resolved either by courts or by the fact that the administration makes decisions about what they want to do with regard to international trade. But my view is that the key focus of, if your question is about fiscal crisis, is really going to come down to what do we do with regard to the tax cuts that need to either be renewed, expanded, which is part of the debate right now, or in some ways curtailed in light of the fiscal space that we have.
Should I go?
Yes. Go.
Well, look, I don't think that the US dollar as the reserve currency of the world is at risk now. Let me put that clear. Despite the fact that the public debt here in the United States today is 98% of GDP, and under the baseline scenario of the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, is going to go to almost 120% of GDP in 10 years. If you add to that there is an extension of the tax benefits and that fiscal policy can actually result in higher deficits, I mean, the public debt is going to go higher. That by itself, I don't think it's going to change the condition, the status quo of the US dollar. But if you add to that a US economy that is more isolated, that is more closed, that is erecting more barriers against, allies and countries that the US used to trade with, like Canada and Mexico extensively, I think that undermines the role of the US. I mean, the fiscal issue, but at the same time, an economy that is much more closed. And we haven't discussed at dimension here, which is retaliation.
Yeah.
Other countries are going to retaliate against this. And that has consequences. Take the example of China. China is the only country that so far has retaliated. What they've done is put another 10% tariff on 72 manufacturing sectors. Trucks and agricultural equipment here in the United States, they're already now subject to an additional tariff when they go to China. If you look at the effects of that, by the way, just a political parenthetical remark here. There are 700,000 American workers in those industries. And almost 500 work in red counties that voted primarily for Trump. So this is a very first example of how things can backfire. You put a tariff on China, China reacts, hurts your industry, and is hurting, the political base of Trump. Indiana, Ohio, it's interesting, and so you never know where these things end. In the meantime, and with this I'll end on the US dollar, part of the use of tariffs is to get some in exchange for national security in the United States, say the fentanyl issue, the illegal migration issue. If you use that argument that the tariffs for national security purposes, then you would also generate a reaction on the part of your allies that think, well, maybe it's not so good, it's not so credible to engage in a free trade agreement with the United States or depend and rely on USAID. Maybe we should look elsewhere. Maybe we should look to China. And if more and more countries in the world do that, say emerging economies, well, that ultimately, in a span of decades, can of course undermine the role of the US dollar. So I don't see it happening now, but the combination of all this could result in the dollar at least facing some competition as the reserve currency of the world.
So let me just add one comment as a non-economist on this panel. I'm not worried most about a fiscal, crisis coming out of this. I think Wally has said it so well. It's such an incredible economy, the U.S., and conditions are not going to cause a near-term trigger. I don't see that. And I'm not of the view that the U.S. can never use tariffs for advancing economic priorities or national security priorities. It's a question of the credibility of their use and the applications. Here we're talking about very widespread applications for a variety of purposes. And so I think to me it's a credibility of their application with respect to the harms. And then how do you deal with those countries that are our close allies, as well as those with whom we have real concerns? So I think we've lost some of that nuance in the current debate, and it's also not clear where we're going. But the uncertainty, I think, is going to create hesitation to invest, volatility, and others can speak more how much of each will occur.
Thank you. I actually want to follow up with a trade question too. And Merritt, you mentioned this, but I'd be interested in others' views. If this trend toward more isolation, the U.S. being more isolated, continues, what do you see as the prospects and the costs of a larger, if not global, then widespread multi-country trading agreement that, I can't say it excludes the United States, but attempts to ignore the United States at least initially? Is that a real prospect, or are there other things afoot that we should be thinking about?
Would you like me to take the first?
I was going to say you can kick it off,
others may
but
have
I'm interested
views,
in everybody else's views too.
Well, there are parts of the world like Asia, ASEAN, that are trying to stitch themselves together in a more integrated market. And while the rest of the world is sort of, there's a real pause on multilateralism, there is growing regionalism in Asia and elsewhere. I think it's very important for the U.S. to be part of that, and at the moment we've been very hesitant to join those further integration efforts. So I think some of that will be natural to regions that want to bring themselves together and not just in opposition to the U.S. They'd want the U.S. to be part of it, but it'll go forward others. Some will be in opposition to the U.S., and the BRICS initiative is part of that. And so I would expect there'd be more momentum around that. And others will be defensive, feeling that they have to do things because the U.S. is not interested in being a party. So I think you're going to see a lot of different responses around the world.
I think one of the strengths we have in the United States is the deepest, most liquid capital markets in the world. And you have to come back to why that is. A lot of that has to do with strength in the United States, but a big part of it is the strength of the rule of law here in the United States. And if the world starts to doubt the strength of the rule of law, either domestic law or our willingness to follow many of the rules internationally that frankly we drove and created, I do think that that is going to have an impact here in terms of capital flows, which have been quite strong, frankly, over the last several decades. Ultimately, the hard part for the world, which is proving to be true today, is the U.S. remains the biggest, most dynamic market in the world. That could change, but for the time being, the uncertainty is leaving people in a position where, in many ways, they are thinking that the best way to deal with trade uncertainty is, if I'm going to build something for the United States, I probably should just build it here in the United States rather than trying to build it in Mexico or in Canada. And I think that, to some degree, speaks to the preferences of this administration. My view is that is a short-term solution to a longer-term problem, and over time, if the U.S. economy becomes less dynamic and the global economy becomes less dynamic, you're going to see slower growth, and the people who care deeply about changing the system are the ones who are going to benefit the least. But I think that that is the proposition at the moment, which is that uncertainty about whether I can invest in a third country and then send that product to the United States likely will drive some additional capital into the United States in the short term. But over the long term, the system that creates fair trade and allows U.S. companies to benefit from that has benefited us for decades, and I think that it needs to be reformed. But ultimately, it's to the benefit of all Americans to have a system that actually works.
I just thought I would compliment that. I'm complete agreement, and one of the things that's been getting a lot of attention is relative to maybe a decade ago, the share of treasuries that are held by foreign investors is down. They're still buying, it's just they're buying as a percentage than is being issued. But what's interesting during that period is there's still a lot of capital inflows into the equity market, and you see it in the dollar. And so here it's you need to distinguish between what part of the markets that you're looking at. But overall, I think Wally's exactly right. A lot of international capital decisions are all relative valuation propositions, right? And so I think the initial conditions are still quite favorable, and we're seeing that in that data.
Yeah. Thank you. Both of your points reminded me of we may be seeing greater economic fragmentation. We've seen some, maybe some more in the coming years. The financial fragmentation, not so much. There are ways, as Wally noted, to wreck that, but it hasn't really happened so far. Okay, it's definitely time for Q&A from all of you. The lights are a little bright, so please raise your hands. I particularly want to encourage the students to raise their hands and ask a few questions.
Sorry. Hi.
One right here?
Thank you for, can I stand?
Yeah, please, go right
So
ahead.
thank you for your expert expositions. I'd like to ask, since you've been talking about certainty and what is happening today, it's been a really short period with a lot of uncertainty. Is there, or can you kind of foresee a turn back due to the backlashes of the private sector market and all the responses that could bring all of these tariffs?
I'm the new guy, can I ask a question? Who are you and what do you study?
Okay. My name is Patricia. I'm a second-year MPA student here at SIPA, and I'm from Chile.
Thank you.
Thank you. I meant it. Should have a bad moderator. Why don't we take two questions? I saw there was one over here too, please. Again, name and program, please.
Hi, my name is Alejandro Lobo. I'm from Colombia. I wanted to ask you, well, more of a question of an institutional arrangement. We have seen that tariffs and the Trump administration policies can lead to an increase in inflation. And we have seen that the president is very hesitant to have institutional discourses with the Fed to try to, in a way, take it easy with the Fed. What can we expect the relationship of the government and the Fed in the following years, considering that the rise in inflation will probably limit the capacity of the Fed to lower rates, and that the president will be very fired up because of this consideration?
So I know who that question's for.
Yeah.
But the uncertainty question? Any views from the panelists?
Well, let me just say that, I think you're beginning to see some different business and other interests express themselves. Business associations expressing concerns, wanting more certainty. And so I think, the way trade works is that different interests get activated by different measures, and they start speaking up and expressing themselves. And there'll be effects across many industries, and it will affect workers, it'll affect consumers. Consumers are dispersed and tend not to be organized, but workers and manufacturers tend to be quite organized. So I think you'll see this coming out, and then we'll just see what kind of effects it'll have on policy.
Maybe I can take the Fed question. And so, institutionally, the Fed is set up as an independent agency with fixed terms. And so there are no vacancies on the Fed. So a president's real ability to shape monetary policy is through his or her appointments, and there are no vacancies now. Their vacancies will begin to open up next year. In particular, Jay Powell's term as Fed chair is up in May of 2026. However, there is a Senate confirmation process. I can tell you it is not a rubber stamp, and so
agree with that.
Wally will agree with that. Merritt as well. So I do believe that that President Trump will want to put his person in the Fed, but the names of people that are appearing are all folks who would certainly be qualified and could get confirmed. The important thing about the Fed as an institution is that its structure was designed and as the result of political compromises in 1913. And as an academic studying the Fed, I used to find that sort of an archaic, inefficient structure. But inefficient structures do have their benefits in the sense that there's a lot of institutional inertia. In particular, by statute, interest rate decisions are made by a standing committee, the Federal Open Market Committee. We talk about the personalities, the Greenspan Fed, the Powell Fed, the Bernanke Fed, but there are 12 people around the table who by statute each have a vote. And so even a president's ability to put in his people, only a fraction of those are actually presidential appointees. The remaining votes are by the Reserve Bank presidents. This is just a way of saying that I don't have concerns now about what the ultimate outcomes will be, but it's certainly going to be an interesting and rocky and volatile period between then and between now and then. But the Fed as an institution has survived for 112 years, and I think it will continue.
Okay, cool. A couple more questions. Okay, we've got one down here in the front row and one over here on the aisle. So two down here. Yeah, thank you.
So, hello everyone. My name is Wally. I'm in the Global Leadership Program. So thank you for insightful debate. So we really learned much. I have just two things to say. First, I think I come from engineering background and economics as well. I'm studying here global policy challenges. So my take of what's happening now is we are seeing a new concept of trade. It's called trade deterrence. What the President of the United States is trying to do is using trade heavily against all countries in the globe. And here is the story. Albert Einstein once said that theory, when everything works properly on paper, but in practice, we cannot make it work. And practice is the opposite. We see many things, but we fail to explain it. The idea here is, on paper, we should reduce deficit. Trade deficit, we are using taxes, tariffs. And budget deficit, we are using DOGE. But the point, and also for inflation, we are trying to undo all sustainability policies. That's the three main ideas of this president. So the idea is, here is the penny. This penny costs last year 3 cents to produce it. 10 years ago, the same penny costs 1.5, which means it's doubled in 10 years. The idea is what Doge is saying about this penny, how we can do about it. What you should do, just stop producing pennies because it's too expensive. But this does not answer the question why we cannot produce with more competitive way. That's the first question. The second, how the other parts of the Atlantic is doing to produce the same thing. In Europe, I came from European Union, I'm French, Moroccan. So the idea is they produce the same penny for their currency with half the price. The question is, efficiency, it's not to undo the services that are online or are available. The efficiency is how we can reduce the costs and keep the same value, because we should not confuse value and price. It costs 3 cents, yes, but it serves something for more than 25 years. And there is my take, last, but because others will ask questions as well. I have 2 questions quickly. Last year, yeah, one question. So last year, Nobel Economic Prize was about institutions. Why nation fail? And why the economic prize was awarded last year is because institution matters. That's really what we learned from last year economic Nobel Prize. The question now here is, if we undo many good institutions with the efficiency reasons, the question is, where are checks and balances? How do you see checks and balances in the future? Especially, do you see that global South, European Union, other nations can do something together to face the tariffs? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Sarah Godfrey, and I'm a student of international economic policy here at SIPA. And so my question was also on Fed independence. While I agree with the analysis about, the independent nature of the Fed, I think part of the thing that I'm concerned about is underwriting public trust in the Fed and confidence in the Fed and the Fed's independence. For example, I saw this morning, I think 4 hours ago, from the Wall Street Journal that Trump tweeted out, a rate cut would go hand in hand with upcoming tariffs. Let's rock and roll, America. So, I mean, with all of this messaging coming from Trump about, oh, the Fed should do this, the Fed should do that, and also the narratives of slashing government bureaucracy, do you see a real risk in undermining Fed or the public's confidence in the Fed having, impacts in the future?
Okay, so efficiency.
So yeah, maybe I'll take that on. I think that you've touched on something, which is that there is a difference between efficiency and effectiveness. And the thing the American people probably want is effectiveness. Ultimately, how do you reimagine government to make it more effective is something that we have done from time to time, and we have to continue doing in this country. That's different than getting rid of the institutions that serve people. For example, if you're receiving Social Security, you want the Social Security Administration to have the staff to answer your phone call. You want to make sure that you're able to get your payments from the Treasury Department, and you don't want to have your mother, your grandmother, your friends doubting the fact that your payments may not come if you live in a certain state, if you're a certain person. That's why the rule of law is so important, not just to those individuals, but also to people who are trusting their investments in the United States. But I do think the thing we have to do is that focus on the fact that even though the approach may be wrong, ultimately, reimagining government is something that we need to think about. We have to think about how do we think about changing the global trading system, because I think when you look at it, you may not agree that tariffs are the tool that should be used at first, second, and third order, but everyone admits that the global trading system needs to evolve to the 21st century. How we do that is a debatable matter, and it's one that we should have a debate about and we should agree to amongst like-minded countries. But we can't act as if there isn't a need for a change. But the key is, I think the key you picked up on, which is that there's a big difference between efficiency and effectiveness. And what people want is effectiveness, and government has the ability to deliver that, and we have to focus on doing that. And that's exactly what all of you are thinking about here at SIPA, and that's why I'm excited about getting a chance to work with you.
Let me add one thought. You said that so well, Wally, and I think about, what are the challenges of the future? If we think about the challenges of the future, they really can't just be undertaken by actions by the United States alone. We have to work with the world when we think about how are we going to develop our own approaches to AI, to many challenges. So it's not that we can necessarily force our views on the world. So there has to be a scope in there for building new frameworks that are a result of collaboration. I think every one of the Bretton Woods institutions need to be updated badly. Each one, particularly, I would say, the International Trading System framework. But it does offer a measure of protection for the smooth flow of trade. So how do you drive change without destroying the security and predictability? I think that's what we have to work towards. And so it's not easy to drive change, and maybe some disruption is needed, but striking that balance is also important.
Maybe just a little bit more on Fed independence. I actually think that, well, first of all, we saw this movie before in 1.0. There's the famous tweet of who's the greater enemy of the American people, Jay Powell or Xi Jinping. So I think after that, I don't think anything would shock me. But the real point is I actually think the Fed's in an institutionally better position, ironically, because inflation's above target and inflation is very unpopular. And I think right now the Fed's in a point where they're on hold, potentially for a long time, and I don't think that'll be a difficult place for Jay Powell, the committee, to defend, with markets and with a lot of people. As I talk about in my piece today, I talk about not the baseline, but there is a scenario which is more of a replay of 2019, where the headwinds from uncertainty and the bark is worse than the bite on tariffs lead to a situation where you actually have a slowdown in the economy. Then I think it could put the Fed in an interesting and perhaps a tough spot. Like, why aren't you cutting because of concern about future policy? But right now, where they are, they've cut 100 basis points. Inflation came in a little bit hot, and so I think being on hold is going to be a pretty straightforward decision for them this year. If they need to happen, if the data improves, I think they've got room to cut.
Okay. Yeah, please, Maurizio.
Yeah, if I could add my 2 cents here on the issue of the Fed and the institutions. Look, maybe 50 years ago, 40 years ago, what's happening today in the United States would create, the entire world will be very worried, very nervous. There'll be lots of uncertainty everywhere. But we don't live in that world anymore, fortunately. We live in a world where the emerging economies play a much greater role. The world economy doesn't depend entirely on the United States. We don't depend on one country doing the right thing, which is good. So if you look, for example, at other central banks, just to take the case of central banks, in the last month, they have been cutting rates in India, in Indonesia, in Mexico, which means, they're worried, they see the uncertainty, but, they can manage this volatility. And that, to me, speaks very well of the world in which we live, to the extent that we don't emulate what the United States is doing everywhere. Because if there's contagion in that sense, then, of course, things can get worse. On the institutions, I wanted to say something about international financial institutions. Because I think international financial institutions are still very dominated by the US Treasury. So as they are dominated by the US Treasury, of course, their decisions, their governance depends on the US Treasury. And they're going to be afraid of speaking out. They're very worried now on what to put in the World Economics Outlook, the next issue, in terms of assumptions, because they can get a lot of reaction. So that means we still have to strengthen the governance of those institutions. That means the voting rights, so that they reflect more what's happening in the world economy, so that we have those institutions in a better position to deal with a government that sometimes could do the wrong thing. I mean, could mismanage the public finances or the trade policies, or et cetera. We're not at that point yet. And I want to underscore the importance of strengthening those institutions.
You mean lessening U.S. influence?
Yeah, I mean, reflecting more the way the world economy is today. I think that would be good, because that will be something that will at least mitigate some of the consequences of what we're seeing here in the United States, that they don't get to become worse, and they become worse problems.
I think the problem, and I think this is one of those questions we have to talk about, the U.S. economy still represents 25% of the global economy. So you could easily say that in some of these institutions, I think the U.S. is maybe at 15% in the IMF, which would say in some ways the U.S. could be undervalued. But I do think the point is that we need to have vigorous debates about what these institutions should look like and how they work going forward, because ultimately the U.S. benefits a great deal from the certainty and predictability these institutions have created over time. But I think everyone knows that reform and change is needed, because the global economy has changed since many of these institutions were created back during Bretton Woods. And I think having those discussions here at SIPA matter, because it gives us an opportunity to bring the world together here to talk about them. And hopefully that helps to influence the way that policymakers, not just here in the United States, but around the world, think about what comes next.
So thank you. And the screen up here is hollering at me to wrap up. And so I think that's all the questions we can take. Thank you all very much for coming. I've hopefully given all of you something to think about and talk about. The last 2 weeks have been a lot of headline grabbing. And so I hope you'll keep today's conversation in mind when you start to say, wait a minute, what should we really be thinking about? Is there something that we missed? In terms of what's important here. There's still a lot of uncertainty. Hopefully that's going to get resolved in the not incredibly distant future, at least on some fronts. But I think there is a distinct difference between some of the headlines and some of the things I think that from an economic policy standpoint we should be concerned with. So thank you all. Please join me in thanking the panelists.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.